I'm Terrence McNally. Welcome to Freeform, a world that just might work. I'm joined today by Chuck Collins, a senior scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies, and the author most recently of Born on Third Base. A one percenter makes the case for tackling inequality, bringing wealth home, and committing to the common good. We'll talk about inequality in America and the GOP's proposed tax bill that will make things much worse. But first, after hosting and producing the show for nearly 2 decades, in 2014, I stopped recording new live interviews, and the show continued on the Progressive Voices Network on TuneIn, streaming relevant interviews each week from the archives. Podcasts are available anytime, anywhere on iTunes, Podomatic.com, and at my site, terrencemcnally.net, TerrenceMcNally.net, or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. They're the same website. But with the election of Donald Trump, I can't resist exploring the path forward in new interviews. So first, let me offer you a few websites for information on how to participate in responding to Trump and moving past him toward the healthy and just future we need. And you can email me at temcnally@mac.com to get these websites and more. Indivisibleguide.com. That's one word, indivisibleguide.com. That's probably the biggest, most together organization working to oppose and get beyond Donald Trump. They have local groups in about 5,000 cities, I believe. MoveOn.org, which has been around for years doing mostly online organizing, but now coordinating much more closely with the grassroots. OurRevolution, the organization that grew out of the Bernie Sanders campaign. And two that are very specific, townhallproject.com, which you go there and you can see when your representatives are holding town halls nearby. And then 5 calls with the number 5 and then the word calls, 5calls.org, that can tell you the calls that you might make that are relevant to legislation and that sort of thing that's in it, needs your timely intervention. And then for those of you in California, couragecampaign.org. Again, been around for quite a while. The emphasis most of the time was on online organizing, but they too have seen that you've got to do the online and the on the streets together. couragecampaign.org for those of you in California. Now, we've talked a lot over the years about inequality in America, how large it is, how much it's growing, what it means in terms of individual people and families, as well as to society at large and the health of our democracy. In 2016, a segment of the population was angry enough that they elected Donald Trump, a demagogue who's working to pass a GOP tax bill that is the clearest victory yet for the 1%. Let's dig a little deeper. It's well established that in rich societies, the poor have shorter lives and suffer from almost every social problem. But the book, The Spirit Level by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, based on 30 years of research, makes clear that more unequal societies are bad for the well-off as well as the poor. They show conclusively that the well-being of whole societies is correlated not with the average income, but rather with the size of the disparity of income between the top 20% and the bottom 20%. Only Singapore has greater inequality than the USA. A graph in the book shows how the U.S. is basically off the charts in terms of both income inequality and health and social problems. Same with prevalence of mental illness. And while not as extreme, this relationship between inequality holds true for child well-being, illegal drug use, life expectancy, infant mortality, obesity, educational scores, dropout rates, teen pregnancy rates, homicide, rates of imprisonment, social mobility or the lack thereof, CO2 emissions, rates of recycling, and even, and this may surprise you, rates of innovation and patents per million and levels of trust. According to Zach Carter in the Huffington Post, the U.S. median household income adjusted for inflation has grown by just 1.5%. That's $839 since the beginning of the Great Recession. Over that same period, the total annual economic output of the United States has grown at 10 times that rate. So how does the Trump GOP tax proposal make things worse? Well, I won't do the question justice in this introduction. I'm sure we'll talk about it in the conversation. But a $1.5 trillion corporate tax cut would go straight to people who own stock in corporations. Another $696 billion would go toward repealing an alternative minimum tax, a provision that's supposed to prevent the super rich from paying no taxes at all. Another $596 billion tax cut would assist so-called pass-through entities, that's hedge funds, investment vehicles, law firms, other things rich people use. And best of all, for them, is the repeal of the estate tax, which would enable millionaire and billionaire families to pass their fortunes on from generation to generation without ever having to pay taxes on their financial assets. Now, to today's guest. In 1986, at the age of 26, Chuck Collins, the great-grandson of meatpacking giant Oscar Mayer, gave away his trust fund. And by 1995, he had co-founded the nonprofit advocacy group United for a Fair Economy. Collins is a senior scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies, where he directs the program on inequality and the common good. He's co-editor of inequality.org, co-author with Bill Gates Sr., of Wealth and Our Commonwealth, Why America Should Tax Accumulated Fortunes. He's the author of Robin Hood Was Right, A Guide to Giving Your Money for Social Change, 99 to 1, How Wealth Inequality is Wrecking the World and What We Can Do About It, and his most recent, Born on Third Base. Welcome again, Chuck Collins, to Freeform, A World That Just Might Work.
Hey, thanks for having me, Terrence.
Oh, very welcome, Chuck. And let me tell listeners, by the way, we're recording this conversation on Sunday, November 26th, just in case events, rush past something we say here. So we're recording it on Sunday the 26th. I mentioned your latest book, Born on Third Base. And it seems to me, Chuck, that you reveal more of your personal experience than in previous work. Am I right?
Yeah, I felt like it was important to talk about kind of how Advantage works from the perspective of someone who grew up in the 1%.
Mm-hmm. And when I'm not conducting interviews, I work with organizations to tap what I say the unique power of story and narrative, and I suggest that we all live in stories within stories, and it seems to me what we're talking about today, we might be able to approach some of that through that lens. There's your personal story. There are multiple stories of inequality. There's the story of how we got here, the political story. There's the story of what it costs us. Again, millions of individual and family stories. There's the story of what it looks like in other countries, other economies, Scandinavia or Germany, for example. And finally, how do we change things? The stories of how we get from here to some new place, some vision that we can tell a story about that doesn't yet exist. So first, Chuck, tell us more about your personal story. What was life like growing up, and what led you to that decision at 26?
Well, I grew up in a wealthy suburb of Detroit, and I probably could have just stayed inside the bubble, if you will, a life of privilege and advantage, except a couple things. One is we lived right by Detroit, and when I was 7, there was the Detroit riots or uprising, whatever people refer to it, but it was really a watershed moment in the life of Detroit 50 years ago last summer. And I was, like any young person, just asking my parents a million questions and trying to understand what was going on. And it was really my mother who said, this has to do with that gap between city and suburb, white and black, rich and poor. It has to do with inequality. And it really, that was the seed that was planted in my experience and how I've come to look at the world. But I went on and really one formative experience is my first job after college. I worked with mobile home park tenants who were trying to buy their parks as cooperatives. So I had this intimate front row seat to people who were trying to, survive as the economy was starting to slow down and wages were starting to stagnate in the 1980s. But I also had this front row seat to wealth creating wealth, coming from a wealthy family, talking to friends and family and peers and learning wealth is multiplying at the top. Assets are doubling every couple of years. So when people started talking about inequality in the 1990s, for me it was, I knew the faces and the people. It was not an abstract set of numbers. It was really, as you say, it was people's stories.
So you make a decision that to to experience life more like the people that are to your right and to your left as you're working for these reforms and so on? You just decided, I'll even the playing field, at least in my situation?
In some ways, what I came to appreciate was that the wealth that was in my name was kind of an impediment to my making my own way. It was also an impediment to kind of having authentic community and connection. So imagine, I'm in my mid-20s, and I am working with these tenants that are kind of, they're all in it for each other. I grew up in a wealthy community where people were generous and charitable, but I'd never had an experience of solidarity and sort of support for one another, reciprocity, really. So I kind of wanted what some of those folks had, and I came to believe that that the wealth was sort of an impediment to my having authentic relationships with people. Mm-hmm. It was more of a spiritual choice in that way, but I also really didn't think it was a good idea to have a society governed by inheritances, where some people like me, and I gave away the money, as you said, but the reality is I have so much other advantage just wired into my life because of growing up in a family with 4 generations of economic stability. We're white, we own property, social networks, going to schools, access to education, access to home ownership. I could go down the list, but there's so much advantage wired into my life that even after I gave away the money, I came to realize, wow, I'm kind of like floating on a wave of advantage here.
Mm-hmm. So the work that you were doing at that point, I mentioned that 10 years later, you had founded United for a Fair Economy. What were those 10 years between 85 and 95 about for you?
Well, it was very, very much about working with communities trying to get control over their land and housing. I worked with community land trusts and housing cooperatives around the country. I worked for a group that provided technical assistance, and it just gave me a real opportunity to travel, see a lot of people doing, effective organizing in their communities, and also just seeing the impact of how these inequalities were sort of opening up and seeing how people were surviving as wages were stagnating and falling, taking on more debt, taking on, more work and more hours of work. So it just gave me an appreciation of just how toxic these inequalities were. And so, yeah, I was working in local communities, but I was sort of trying to pay attention to the trends in the larger economy, and it was just clear that we were really pulling apart as a society in both income, wealth, opportunity, all the things you mentioned, health outcomes. And I was in a position to maybe do something about that, and joined with several others to co-found a group to primarily focus on these issues of inequality. We were talking about the 99-to-1 challenge in 1995, how the 1% share of wealth and income was growing.
When I went back and looked at earlier interviews I had with you, I think I started doing the show in 96, and I think you were one of the folks I interviewed within the first year about United for a Fair Economy and exactly the 99-to-1.
In some ways, it's discouraging to think I've been trying to, we've been working on this for 20 years, and it seems like the problem is getting worse. But I'm actually heartened by how the consciousness around these inequalities is so much higher. Just people recognize the inequalities, and I think, and this is partly the reason I wrote Born on Third Base, I think a lot of wealthy people are waking up to the fact that, these trends are, as you said in the book, The Spirit Level, these trends are undermining the quality of life for everyone, including wealthy people. And part of my argument to my fellow 1%ers is, these inequalities are going to undermine democracy, the health of the economy. They already are undermining civic and social cohesion. You don't want to live in a society. You don't want to live in a society where this is taking us, and you certainly don't want your children and grandchildren to live in an economic apartheid society. So I actually kind of make the case that it's in the self-interest of even people in the 1% to change the trajectory that we're on.
One thing that the spirit level, that book I mentioned, because I think, whatever else any of us, the rest of us may say about inequality, they really looked at the data. And the point they make, Chuck, is that the wealthy in a highly unequal society don't do as well as the wealthy in a more equal society. So, it's not even like having to convince them, it's a moral or ethical thing to do. It's just that their health is impacted by this. Everything about them. One thing that I'm thinking is when I look at the current tax bill that we will talk about in more detail, the way that it is going to affect college education and graduate education in the years to come. It's, if I were running a corporation now, I'd be screaming to stop that.
Absolutely. I think that the other thing is, if you put an ecological overlay on this whole story, we're heading toward an ecological deterioration. There, is again what I say to people in the 1%, and I talk to a lot of groups of high-end, high-net worth people. I say, look, there is no wealth in a degraded earth. There's no wealth if the fresh water and soil is contaminated. So it's entirely in your perfect self-interest to not allow, to get engaged and fix the future and use the resources at your disposal to really, shift the direction of the society. So I think it's a win-win case. It's not to say everyone is persuaded. There's clearly a segment of the very wealthy who use their wealth and power to get more wealth and power and are living inside of a story of both, we deserve this wealth, but also we're going to be protected from the downside.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just argue that's delusional. There is no planet B, and there is, there's not a mountain high enough that is going to protect the wealth of the super rich. They may feel like they're buffered now, but their children and grandchildren are going to want to live in this world. So it's a different conversation that we've come to a different point in some ways.
And can you perhaps cite a particular anecdote or a moment when your conversation with a peer of yours in the 1% evidenced this shift?
The good news is I'm kind of having those discussions all the time, and let me think. There's I can remember actually speaking at a very wealthy congregation outside Los Angeles, where a guy who had been a very high up executive in a private company came to a talk that I gave, and I talked about we have these stories that justify these inequalities. And I gave an example. The basic story is you get what you deserve. If you have a lot of wealth, it means you deserve it. You get up early, work hard, take risks, etc. And if you don't have a lot of wealth or you're economically precarious, it's because you are deficient in some way. And that powerful story almost sort of keeps people from seeing the real data, the real trends that we're living with. And when I mentioned it to this man, he kind of lit up and he said, I had to leave the United States to have my heart cracked open to the impact of these inequalities. I had to go to a place where my story couldn't explain the gap between my good fortune and the people I was meeting. But once my heart was cracked open, I came back and I could see the systems of inequality in the greater Los Angeles area. I could see that people were working extremely hard, but were subject to, structural barriers to having a decent life, that it wasn't their fault. So I sort of see those lights come on, those glimmers of new stories supplanting these old myths of deservedness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is so much an American an American story, an American myth, the up by your bootstraps, and they just don't notice that some people don't have any bootstraps.
It's a powerful narrative, and some people will hold on to it till their dying breath.
Yeah.
But once what I find is that people have a story of deservedness, but then if you ask them questions like, well, so were you born in a state of nature? Did anybody help you along the way? Were there institutions? Were there public investments? Oh yeah, I got a free ride to college, and I got a low interest mortgage from the government after the war. Oh, the U.S. Patent Office defended my intellectual property and defends my property rights internationally. There's this whole commonwealth of supports, public and private and charitable institutions and government infrastructure. All that commonwealth is the foundation of individual wealth. There is no individual wealth outside that web. Once people see that, it's like the Matrix, Terrence. Once they see the Matrix, then all of a sudden those old stories of, I did it all alone and I'm just like floating out here in outer space creating wealth, they start to fall apart.
Okay, let me talk a little bit to some of the stuff you're doing on a local basis in the Boston area. You're a co-founder of the Jamaica Plain New Economy Transition and the Jamaica Plain Forum, Jamaica Plain being an area within Boston. What's going on there, Chuck?
Part of the message that I've tried to say in Born on Third Base is to the wealthy to come home, put your stake in a place, your full commitment to making that place the most equitable, healthy community possible. And part of that is to look at the economic and ecological challenges ahead. We're heading into a time, the next 20 years are not going to be like the last 50 years. We're going to have all kinds of challenges. And so it's very important to build at the local level healthy, resilient economies, local and regional food systems, look at how to get our energy and reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, learn how to make things and provision for ourselves, revitalize gift economies and exchanges. These are all kind of things that we're doing here in the neighborhood I live in, but we're learning from neighborhoods all over the United States and around the world that are transition towns or kind of building community or neighborhood resilience. So I benefit from living in a neighborhood where people are thinking this way and not assuming that the old growth paradigm is going to keep chugging along, and are taking action to help and build a strong neighborhood web. So I'm happy to be part of those at the local level, and I think that's part of the work of wealthy people is to bring the wealth home, to bring it back from the offshore tax havens, et cetera, and the global economy, the global casino, and bring it back and invest it or give it to the local or real economy that's really the economy of the future.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And now it sounded, I must say, as you were saying some of the things that we're going to learn to need how to do, it sounded a little like the 60s to me when, it was like pull away from the machine and so on. But I know it's different this time around, isn't it?
Well, I think it's different in that there's an overriding kind of ecological imperative there. We're not going to be able to, extract and burn, coal, gas, and oil to kind of have the kind of stimulation of the economy that we had in the 50s and 60s and really the industrial age. We're going to have to find some ways to live within our Earth's finite boundaries. So that, I think you're right, there's this sort of community economic localism spirit that we can look to the 60s and 70s, and I think it's got new legs because of the ecological constraints.
And by the way, something I've been thinking when I've thought about some of the millennial values seeming to, for me, echo some of the 60s, the young 60s values at those young people's same age. I see a couple of other, so the ecological crisis is the backdrop of it all, but then I also see some things which give us a better chance this time around with the technologies that make organizing all of this much easier. And the fact that it's not it's not about a generation gap. It's not that the millennials are, the only ones sort of saying, "Wait, let's go this way." I'm saying their second advantage is that there are boomers, there are folks in between who have come to the same realizations. It's a much bigger movement. And finally, that it is a much more diverse movement, that as much as the 60s were about civil rights and so on, still the organizations were dominated. Most organizations, alternative organizations, other than the civil rights movement, were dominated by white males. And nowadays, I see such a larger talent pool to utilize and tap with women and minorities and just this whole range of people having a bigger voice, which means just more creativity and more possibility.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a resurgence, kind of a new community economy being built in the shell of the old market economy, and a greater value being placed on connection and celebration and local culture, and people realizing we're waiting to be called to something bigger than just consumption. We want to reconnect with our fundamental nature as community people. So I see those institutions forming around that and groups forming around that I think are going to help us through this transition going forward.
Okay, we're at about the halfway point. This is Freeform, a world that just might work. I'm Terrence McNally. I'm speaking with Chuck Collins, and you can learn more about Chuck's work at chuckcollins7.com, and you can find Chuck's articles at Huffington Post and The Nation. And his most recent book is Born on Third Base, a one-percenter makes the case for tackling inequality, bringing wealth home, and committing to the common good. Let's talk a little bit more about how things are broken. Okay, I'm going to read a couple of things, but then I want you to chime in. And some of this is from an article that you and Jeff Hoxie wrote just recently. Jeff Bezos, this is a quote, head of Amazon, recently became the richest person on earth. His wealth jumped by $10 billion in just the month of October to $90 billion. That's, as I believe you're the one that quotes it as, that's $4 million increase per second for that entire month. And yet Amazon pays some of its workers as little as $12.84. And the fact that Bezos and the next two wealthiest Americans, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, together now own more wealth than the entire bottom half of the American population combined. Use that as a lead-in to some of the stuff in your new report, Billionaire Bonanza 2017, the Forbes 400, and the rest of us.
Yeah, what we're seeing, and we did this report a couple of years ago where we looked at the Forbes 400 and what their sort of share of the big wealth pie was. And, just 2 years ago, the wealthiest 20 combined had as much wealth as the bottom half of U.S. households. But now it's just the three, Jeff Bezos, Buffett, and Gates together have, as much wealth as the bottom half of U.S. households. And part of why that's possible is because the number of households with zero or negative wealth is creeping up. So 20% of U.S. households have zero or negative wealth, and 30% of African American households, 27% of Latino households have zero or negative wealth. So we're seeing both a concentration of wealth at the very top among the billionaires and a rising insecurity in the overall population.
Let me jump in with another just mind-blowing statistic from your article. In 1982, Forbes started compiling their list of the 400 wealthiest Americans, and in 1982, 75 million got you in the 400. Accounting for inflation, that's less than 200 million in today's dollars. Yet today, the 400th person has at least $2 billion. So you talked about the 1 in 5 at the bottom that have zero or negative wealth. And at the other end, at the other extreme, this sort of wealth is just off the charts.
Yeah, the price of entry to join the Forbes 400 has gotten significantly higher. Just one other little trivia is Jeff Bezos just crossed the $100 billion mark the other day.
So he's had another good month.
Probably has to do with that. Black Friday sales or something, but Bill Gates Senior, Bill Gates came very close to being the first 100 billionaire, but Bezos has crossed the line. So this is, it's not going to be that. It'll be in our lifetimes that we'll see the first trillionaire. Somebody who has $1 trillion. Now it's getting a little hard to, imagine what that amount of wealth looks like. But it's this is a very top-heavy, concentrated wealth, and this is what the French economist Thomas Piketty was sort of warning us, saying, "Look, we're on the road to becoming a society with a hereditary aristocracy of wealth and power, where the sons and daughters of today's billionaires will dominate our politics, culture, philanthropy, and the economy." And that's where, we think, well, we're already there. But in fact, we will become more so in the next generation if we don't intervene to reverse these dramatic inequalities.
Yeah, I'm going to throw out one more statistic. Today's 400 richest Americans are 10 times richer than 1983's richest Americans, but the average family is worse off than the average family from 34 years ago. Let's move to, because you said things are going to get worse. Well, one way they can get worse quickly is if the GOP tax bill passes. And in 2003, you were part of the successful fight against the Republican-led effort to repeal the estate tax. This is a key feature of the current tax bill that they're fast-tracking, which they're hoping to pass while most Americans are distracted by the holidays. Do you think we have any hope of stopping them this time? And if so, what can listeners do?
Well, it really is up to the citizenry right now. What's fascinating to me is that people are not falling for this tax bill as much as they're putting, the Koch brothers and others are spending tens of millions of dollars to do TV and marketing. About 16% of the population thinks this tax bill is a good idea, and that they will benefit in any way. And most people think, 60-70%, think that corporations are not paying enough, that they don't need a tax cut, particularly the global corporations that'll benefit the most, and that the wealthy should pay more. The estate tax is just one of the things that people have lifted up to say, look, this isn't going to help the middle class. I mean, you need to have, $5.5 million as an individual, $11 million as a couple, before you start to pay an estate tax. How is that, abolishing that tax, going to help the middle class? I actually think we have a chance of stopping this. We may actually see the estate tax hurt, the wealth exemptions doubled. That's the Senate's proposal without repeal. So we may actually, something will pass. I believe something will pass at some point, because they so desperately need to pass anything that they'll even pass a terrible bill that will not even benefit most of the people in the country, so that they can say they passed something.
I read a headline, and I didn't read the full story, but the headline said that the GOP might be willing to pass an unpopular bill gambling that middle-class Americans will grow to like it if they see their withholding drop. If some of the things, they front-loaded the benefits to the middle class, and that which will expire, and backloaded the benefits to the 1%. And so some people might hate the bill when it passes, but like it when their taxes go. Perhaps some of them, at least. I know it's like which part of the middle class is going to pay more, which is going to pay less. But I think they're hoping that some who will immediately pay less will then grow to like it.
Yeah, I think, Terrence, that is the design of this. But the corporate tax cuts are permanent. The tax cuts for individual working people are temporary. They're there for a couple of years, so that And it's very hard to contest against the tax bill. It's very different than the health care fight, because you could see, the tens of millions of people who would lose their coverage. In this case, it's sort of taxes are one step removed. Most people, they're complicated, but I think it's fair to say this is a money grab. This isn't a tax reform where we're trying to close loopholes and make the system more efficient. It's a simple kind of top-down corporate money grab that is highly unpopular, even among a distracted electorate. People are saying, "Whoa, this is really a bad idea." The fact that they're pushing it through simply shows that their donors, the donors that back this policy, have way more clout than voters at this point.
Yeah, well, we know that, and there was that study from the two Princeton. I'm forgetting their names right now, but you know the one I'm talking about, that actually looked at political decision-making over the last 20 years or so and found that voters have almost no influence if their preferences disagree with donors. Let me just, for people who haven't been following this closely enough, let me just throw out some information about this current tax bill. On Wednesday, November 22nd, Wall Street Journal editor-in-chief Jerry Baker asked a crowd of CEOs whether they were going to increase their investments in new equipment or technology if the GOP bill passed, giving them the proposal is to reduce the corporate tax rate from 35% to 20%. And only a few raised their hands. And Gary Cohn, Trump's chief economic advisor, asked, "Why aren't the other hands up?" So the last time that we did an amnesty for corporate taxes overseas and allowed them to bring them back, almost none of that went into new jobs or new equipment either. It goes into buybacks and dividends. The Republican tax bill calls for $6 trillion worth of tax cuts. Senate rules require them to offset $4.5 trillion of that with new revenues, or else they can be filibustered. That's part of the arcane rules of how they're trying to pass this as a reconciliation bill and not an actual new bill. So where are the cuts? $47.5 billion would be stripped from people paying student debt or attending graduate school. Eliminating the deduction for state and local government taxes, which would bleed municipalities and force cutbacks in public education and infrastructure and the kinds of things that are paid for on a state or local basis. Local governments would get blasted again by the elimination of a $17 billion program to help refinance their debt at lower interest rates. $38.9 billion in financing to build hospitals, affordable housing, and university buildings would be cut. A $54 billion tax credit for research into rare diseases would be eliminated. A $300 million credit for businesses that comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act eliminated. The deduction for personal medical expenses eliminated. That one will hit everyone. Credits for renewable energy, of course, eliminated, because these are backed by fossil fuel folks. And to go with that grad student thing one more time, because I think it's what's going to cost Americans so much in the years ahead. A grad student at MIT had an op-ed in the New York Times recently, and the headline that the Times put on it was, "The House just voted to bankrupt graduate students." The grad student had pointed out that the GOP tax bill repeals a section of the tax code which exempts graduate students' tuition waivers. So a lot of graduate students don't have to pay tuition. They're graduate students. They've earned it. They're doing some teaching. They're doing research. So let's say they don't pay that $50,000 in tuition. According to the GOP tax bill, they will be taxed on that $50,000, which they did not receive. They will be taxed on it. And the estimate is that most graduate students would see their income taxes increase by $10,000 at a time when they are just attempting to tread water. They're just attempting to make enough by, some job, by driving Lyft on the weekends or something to be able to cover. And now they're going to be faced with $10,000. But it's much worse than it sounds. The New York Times made a terrible faux pas because by law, student borrowers are not allowed to declare bankruptcy on their student debt. So the House just voted to bankrupt graduate students. That would be good news. So these are just some of what's going on. You have to get the word out to people in other states, people that might be more conservative than you, because this is going to hurt everybody a lot.
And I would just underscore, a lot of the media talks about, who are the winners and losers in this tax bill, which is a completely distracting frame, because the list that you just put through, those are what the Republicans are calling their pay-fors. This is how they're going to pay for their whopper tax cut for global corporations and the rich. I mean, so those, graduate students, people losing their state and local deduction, all of that is in service of delivering revenue so that they can cut the taxes. And then, a year from now, we're going to be back in austerity mode. We're going to be like, the debt, it's grown again. Now we have to cut more social spending. So there are really no winners.
As a society,
and one other little favorite provision I would just point out is that private jet owners, people who have, fly their own private jets, get additional tax breaks in this bill. Commercial passengers will see their fees go up, their passenger facility fees go up. So it's like, if you want to know who really is going to benefit from this tax bill, think of people who fly in private jets. Those are the real winners, if you will.
Yeah. Let's talk about, in your new book and in a lot of your thinking, you're looking at how we can change things. We talked about some of the things that you're engaged in on a local basis, but in Born on Third Base, you lay out some changes some paths to change. Let's talk about that. What's the big picture there?
Well, I think one thing to recognize is that there is a realignment happening. That there are a growing number of people who believe the economy is rigged. Some of them voted for Donald Trump, but some of them supported Bernie Sanders. And if you put together people who've been adversely affected by inequality, you have a constituency here. And I think that the one way forward is to look at what are the kind of game-changing campaigns that engage a wider public. So we were talking about student debt. There are 40 million households that are paying some form of student debt. That's a considerable and formidable constituency if it was organized. So, why can we have tuition-free higher education and advanced vocational training paid for by a progressive tax on high incomes? That's how we built the middle class after World War II. We had a progressive tax system, and we had considerably lower cost higher education and vocational training. So that's a campaign that I think will ignite a whole constituency that's waiting to be engaged.
I think, by the way, that was one of the planks of Bernie Sanders' platform that I think it not only drew advocates, but engaged passion.
Yes,
when we
I
saw
think absolutely
25,000 people at a rally, that was a big part of it.
Yeah, and I think that our revolution and some of the groups that you mentioned at the top of the show that are really engaging people. I mean, I think right now we're in the kind of defensive, let's not do no harm mode. Don't pass this tax cut, which will worsen these inequalities. But we should quickly jump to the other side of that, which is to because we know that there's wide support for public policies that would raise the minimum wage and raise the floor People want to live in a much more secure society that's more akin to Denmark or Sweden. Even wealthy people experience the stresses of a society where you can be wiped out, destitute because of catastrophic health incidents and unforeseen events. So that chronic insecurity could also be something that galvanizes people.
Right, and it's interesting, you're pointing out health care was attacked, affordable health care was attacked more strongly in the first several months of the Trump administration than it had been previously. And what we've seen so far is that in the first days or weeks of enrollments are up, even though the Trump administration is making it harder to publicize them, harder to help people with it, made it just harder to sign up or re-sign up, and yet enrollments are up. I think we may observe something similar when people see what that Congress is willing to do with the taxes. It may be a wake-up call to people who've been sitting on the sidelines when it came to those sorts of issues as well.
Yeah, and I think there's an opportunity to talk about, well, what do we want the tax code to do? We should be concerned about these concentrations of wealth. We should be restore a progressive income tax and not just save the estate tax, but make it better, close a bunch of loopholes. You could even dedicate the revenue to debt-free education. You could have a Wall Street financial transaction tax that slows sort of the speculative frenzy on Wall Street and raises substantial revenue from a modest tax on financial transactions. It could go to pay and fund some of the real infrastructure projects that would actually boost jobs and help us transition to a more green economy. Those are wildly popular.
Yeah, let me jump in because I've been thinking about that one for a while, Chuck, which is that a tax on investments that we know a great deal of that is not actually investing in making anything. It's it's rapid transactions, it's it's computer generated trades and so on. If you said, okay, what are true investments? You pointed out infrastructure. I would say education and anything that has to do with children. So preschool education, child care, mentorship programs, all of those sorts of things. If you said, now that's real investment, we're going to tax investment transactions to fund real investments in the American future.
And by the way, those are wildly popular ideas. Everyone knows we need to make investments in early childhood education, and states and local governments are trying to figure out how to do that. And if you said, look, let's link it to a source of revenue that reduces the concentration of wealth and power, which is distorting our life, our civic life and economy, those are wildly popular ideas. We in Massachusetts have a ballot question to raise the income tax on people whose income is over $1 million. Just raise it 4%. Dedicate the revenue to education and transportation infrastructure.
Perfect.
And it is polling off the charts. People, it just is a no-brainer, including among some of the people who will pay it.
Yeah.
So I think if we put these bold ideas out there that clearly will make improvements in people's lives, reduce tuition, create green jobs through infrastructure investments, early childhood education, and link it to revenue that will also address this distortions of inequality, you have the basis of a very progressive populist program that also comes with people power. People want this. So I think that's our work going forward.
I only wish it had been made more clear during the 2016 campaign.
Yes, regrets.
Yes, I know. I've had a few. So, okay, in terms of reversing inequality, you mentioned lifting the floor. So that's the minimum wages, universal health care, labor standards, education. Universal basic income. What's your take on that?
I think it's important to start experimenting now, as many communities are doing. The province of Ontario, Canada, is experimenting because of the disruption and the labor-saving technological innovations that are maybe putting huge numbers of people out of work. We should be experimenting with what's a foundational universal basic income, and fund it through charging for the dumping carbon in the atmosphere, or the broadcast rights. Generate revenue from the commons, which belongs to all of us, and provide a universal basic income. It's not. It's actually a kind of a post-partisan idea or transpartisan idea. You see a lot of people saying, we're heading into another period of technological disruption. Let's create a basic income floor of security for people who are going to be displaced by that.
Well, one thing I can see is if I were on that other side and I wanted to elect Republicans, you provide a universal basic income and you weaken labor. You take the issue away from your opposition. There's a lot to be said about it, and I get what you're saying. I mean, by the way, what Alaska has done, a live free or die state if there ever was one, has had this basically in its own form for many years, where the royalties from oil exploration are distributed to all the citizens of Alaska.
Yeah, the Alaska Permanent Fund example. And by the way, we're talking about, in the case of Alaska, I think it's somewhere like $2,000 per member of a household. So if you have a family of 5, that's $10,000. It's not enough to say, I'm quitting work. I'm not going to work. It provides that extra cushion. But you're right. There's a bunch of things that we need. I think we should approach it with, let's create some experiments. Let's create some pilots. In Oakland, there's an effort. There are a couple of laboratories that are kind of looking at it, and how does it affect the health of a community, including Finland. Finland may be the largest scale experiment with the universal basic income. It shouldn't be seen as a replacement for a social safety net. Mm-hmm. It should be a supplement to it. Mm-hmm. So some people think, we'll get rid of all those welfare programs over there. We'll just hand people cash. But there needs to be sort of a social safety net that deals with long-term health, catastrophic care, mental health, overcoming addiction, all the things that good societies do to ensure that people don't fall all the way to destitution.
Yeah. So if I give you a minute and a half here, where I'm giving you the soapbox, and you get to put out your call, what would it be?
Actually, I would say we should have a debt-free higher education program. It could be linked to a national service. Anybody who wants to do 2 years of community service, military or civilian service, would be eligible to get a debt-free higher education, funded by a tax on wealth over $50 million, a progressive wealth tax. And that, I think that would be wildly popular, and it would accomplish a number of things, including kind of reweaving the social fabric of people's connection to their communities. If you do that 2 years of national service, and maybe you do it not in your own community, you do it somewhere else, so you kind of get a deeper connection to community, state, country. And we know that there's no good that can come from this whopping amount of student debt that's on people. And, people are losing their professional licenses because of their inability to pay student debt. So we're creating a whole new sort of debt servitude class, and we should just wipe that out. That is just, there's no good that can come from that.
Very
So
good.
I think that would be my 90-second program.
Okay. So again, you can learn more at Chuck Collins 7. That's one word, chuckcollins7.com. And you can find Chuck's work at Huffington Post and The Nation. His most recent book, as I said, is Born on Third Base. And thank you, Chuck Collins. Keep up the good work.
Thanks, Terrence.
For this conversation and many other interviews, articles, transcripts, and to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to terrencemcnally.net or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. They're the same website. That's TERRENCEMCNALLY.net or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. If you want to receive my weekly email announcements telling you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, and usually 5 to 10 articles that are relevant to what's going on in the world and to those guests, email me at temcnally, TEMCNALLY at mac.com. You can also subscribe and listen to the Freeform podcast on iTunes. You can find years of podcasts at my site or at iTunes. Listen anytime, anywhere. That's Michael Lewis, Jeremy Scahill, Robert Reich, Van Jones, Connie Rice. And thanks finally to G, my engineer, and George Vasilopoulos of Progressive Voices, and most of all to you, my listeners. Please share this podcast widely.